October 27, 1962, deep underwater off the coast of Cuba, a Soviet submarine is trapped, surrounded by American warships dropping depth charges to force it to the surface. The crew has no radio contact with Moscow. They have had no contact with the outside world for days. Down in that hull, nobody knows if the war has already started up above. The air conditioning failed hours ago. The temperature inside has climbed past 100 degrees in some compartments. Carbon dioxide levels are rising. Men are collapsing at their stations from heat exhaustion and lack of oxygen. And in the middle of all of it, 3 officers are standing over the controls of a nuclear torpedo, arguing about whether to fire it at the American fleet above them. 2 of the 3 say yes. Under the submarine's own protocol, it only takes 1 more vote to launch. We'll get back to that moment. Because as unbelievable as it sounds, that's not even where this story starts. That's just the ending. Before we get there are 6 other moments almost nobody has heard of, 6 separate times the world came close to ending completely by accident, in ways that were buried, downplayed, or classified for years, because the people responsible didn't want the public finding out how many times humanity barely made it through. This is round 2 of the closest calls in history. 7 stories. Let's start with the one sitting quietly under the water off the coast of Georgia right now as you're watching this. Number 7 takes us to February 5th, 1958, to a training exercise that went wrong in a way nobody expected. A U.S. Air Force B-47 bomber is flying a simulated combat mission near Savannah, Georgia, carrying a live hydrogen bomb as part of a Cold War-era training exercise. It's meant to be routine. Bombers carrying live weapons on training runs wasn't unusual at the time. It was simply how the Air Force operated during the height of Cold War tensions. During the exercise, an Air Force fighter jet collides with the bomber in midair. The fighter pilot is forced to eject. The bomber, badly damaged but still flyable, is now carrying a hydrogen bomb on an aircraft that may not survive landing. The crew faces an impossible decision. Land with a live nuclear weapon on a damaged aircraft, risking a catastrophic accident on the runway, or drop the bomb into the water near Tybee Island off the Georgia coast, and try to retrieve it later once the situation is safer. They choose to drop it into the shallow waters near the mouth of the Savannah River, in an area they mark for recovery. They never found it. The Air Force launched an extensive search in the weeks that followed, using specialized equipment to comb the riverbed and surrounding waters. After months of searching turned up nothing, the weapon was formally declared irretrievably lost, and the search was called off. To this day, that hydrogen bomb is very likely still sitting somewhere in the mud and silt off the Georgia coast. The Air Force has stated for decades that it does not believe the weapon poses an active danger in its current state, but it has also never been recovered, and never will be. Number 6 moves inland to a single field in North Carolina and to the closest a nuclear weapon has ever come to detonating on American soil. January 23, 1961. A B-52 bomber flying a routine airborne alert mission, the same kind of Chrome Dome mission responsible for other close calls, begins experiencing a serious fuel leak somewhere over eastern North Carolina. As the crew attempts to bring the aircraft back under control, the plane begins breaking apart in midair near the town of Goldspur. The aircraft was carrying 2 hydrogen bombs. As the plane came apart, both weapons fell from the wreckage. The first bomb deployed its parachute exactly as it was designed to in the event of an emergency release, and landed relatively gently in a field, largely intact. The second bomb did not deploy its parachute. It fell in an uncontrolled freefall, in the process of the aircraft breaking apart around it. Several of the mechanical safety switches designed to prevent accidental detonation were triggered in sequence, exactly as if the weapon had actually been armed and deliberately released for use. When investigators later reconstructed exactly what happened, they determined that the bomb had gone through 5 of the 6 separate steps required for it to fully detonate. 5 out of 6 safety mechanisms had failed to hold, whether through the mechanical stress of the crash or design flaws that hadn't been fully understood at the time. The only thing that prevented a nuclear detonation in a field in North Carolina, with a yield far greater than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima, was a single low-voltage switch, one of 6 required safeguards, that happened to not fail alongside the others. Documents related to the incident remained heavily classified for decades. It wasn't until years later, through declassified reports and statements from officials who had reviewed the incident, that the full extent of just how close that bomb came to detonating became publicly known. The unexploded core of that second bomb was never fully recovered. Deep underground at the crash site, portions of the weapon remain buried to this day. The federal government purchased an easement on the land specifically to ensure the area is never disturbed or excavated. There is quite literally a small buried piece of a hydrogen bomb sitting under a field in North Carolina right now, left there because retrieving it was considered more dangerous than simply leaving it in place. Number 5 takes us to a missile silo in rural Arkansas, and to a disaster that started with something as small as a hand tool slipping out of someone's grip. September 18, 1980. Inside a Titan II missile silo near Damascus, Arkansas, an Air Force repairman is performing routine maintenance work on the missile itself. The Titan II was, at the time, the largest and most powerful land-based missile in the American nuclear arsenal, carrying a warhead with an explosive yield roughly 600 times more powerful than the bomb that leveled Hiroshima. During this maintenance procedure, the repairman's socket wrench socket slips from its fitting. It falls nearly 80 feet down the length of the silo, bounces off a support structure, and punctures the missile's first-stage fuel tank. Within moments, highly flammable and toxic rocket fuel begins leaking out and pooling at the bottom of the silo, filling the enclosed space with volatile vapor. Emergency crews are called in immediately, but the situation continues to deteriorate over the following hours. Personnel are evacuated from the immediate area as engineers and Air Force officials scramble to determine how to safely address a fuel leak sitting directly beneath a live nuclear warhead inside a sealed underground structure. Just before 3 AM, roughly 8.5 hours after the initial puncture, the accumulated fuel vapor ignites. The resulting explosion is powerful enough to blow the silo's 900-ton blast door completely off its hinges and send it flying more than 600 feet away. The explosion also launches the missile's nuclear warhead itself out of the silo, hurling it into a nearby ditch. One Air Force serviceman is killed in the explosion, and several others are injured. Remarkably, the warhead's internal safety mechanisms held throughout the entire event. Despite being subjected to an explosion powerful enough to launch it hundreds of feet through the air, the weapon did not detonate. An incident that began with an $8 hand tool slipping out of someone's grip ended with one of the largest man-made explosions in the history of the United States, and came within its safety margins of becoming one of the worst nuclear disasters in American history, entirely by accident, entirely due to human error during a routine maintenance check. Number 4 brings us back to the most dangerous week of the entire Cold War, and to a decision made by a single military commander, without full authorization from the White House. During the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, in October of 1962, Air Force General Curtis LeMay, the head of Strategic Air Command, made the decision to raise the alert status of American nuclear forces to DEFCON 2, the highest level ever reached at any point during the Cold War, outside of the crisis itself, escalating into actual war. What made this moment especially dangerous wasn't simply the alert level itself, but how it was communicated, rather than using encrypted, secure channels, as would typically be standard for such a sensitive military action. The order was transmitted using open, unencrypted communication, essentially ensuring that Soviet intelligence monitoring American military communications would be able to detect exactly what was happening. This decision has been debated by historians for decades. Some have argued it was a calculated show of strength, meant to signal American resolve to the Soviets during an already tense standoff. Others have pointed out that, to Soviet military intelligence already on edge, and anticipating the possibility of an American first strike, watching U.S. nuclear forces move to their highest peacetime alert level, transmitted in a way that all but guaranteed they would see it, looked disturbingly similar to preparation for an actual attack. At a moment where the entire crisis hinged on both sides correctly interpreting each other's intentions without direct communication, one general's decision, made largely on his own authority and without full civilian oversight from the White House, added significant additional risk to an already extraordinarily volatile situation. Number 3 takes us to the sky above Cuba on the exact same day as the submarine standoff we opened with, during what many historians consider the single most dangerous 24 hours of the entire Cold War. October 27th, 1962. An American U-2 reconnaissance aircraft is conducting a surveillance flight over Cuba, part of the ongoing effort to monitor Soviet missile installations on the island during the crisis. As the aircraft crosses into range, whilst it is targeted and struck by a Soviet surface-to-air missile, the pilot, Major Rudolf Anderson, is killed, becoming the only direct combat casualty of the entire Cuban Missile Crisis. Under the military contingency plans President Kennedy's own advisors had pushed for, in the lead-up to this moment, The loss of a U-2 under these exact circumstances was supposed to automatically trigger an immediate American military response against the surface-to-air missile sites in Cuba, a response many officials believed carried a serious risk of escalating rapidly into full-scale war. President Kennedy made the decision, in the moment, to overrule the standing military plan. Rather than authorizing immediate retaliation, he chose to hold off, buying crucial additional time for back-channel diplomatic negotiations that were already quietly underway between American and Soviet officials. That decision, made in the middle of one of the most tense days of the entire Cold War, is widely credited by historians as one of several critical moments where a single choice, made under enormous pressure and with incomplete information, prevented the crisis from escalating into a direct military conflict between two nuclear superpowers. Number 2 takes us to the streets of a divided city, roughly a year before the Cuban Missile Crisis, where two armies stood close enough to see each other's faces across the pavement. October 27, 1961, exactly 1 year to the day before the Cuban events above. Following weeks of rising tension over the rights of American diplomatic personnel to move freely into East Berlin, a standoff develops at Checkpoint Charlie, one of the primary crossing points between American and Soviet-controlled sectors of the divided city. American M48 tanks and Soviet T-55 tanks positioned themselves directly across from each other, roughly 100 yards apart, main guns loaded and aimed, for approximately 16 consecutive hours. Soldiers on both sides were operating under standing orders that left extraordinarily little room for error. A single mechanical malfunction, a misread signal, a soldier's finger slipping at the wrong moment under the stress of a 16-hour standoff. Any one of these had the potential to escalate an already extraordinarily tense diplomatic dispute into the first direct armed conflict between American and Soviet forces of the entire Cold War, in the middle of a city already split in half by an ideological divide. Diplomatic back channels, working urgently behind the scenes throughout the standoff, eventually reached an agreement. Both sides agreed to withdraw their tanks within minutes of one another, allowing both governments to save face without either side appearing to back down unilaterally. The tanks pulled back. The moment passed, and for decades afterward, most of the world had little idea just how close that 16-hour standoff had come to becoming the spark that started something far larger. And now, number 1, back to where we started, the submarine, the vote, and the man who said no. The Soviet submarine B-59 had been submerged for days, cut off from any communication with Moscow, unaware of the current state of the crisis playing out above the surface. When American naval vessels operating in the area detected the submerged submarine, they began dropping practice depth charges, a deliberate tactic intended to force the submarine to surface for identification without actually attempting to destroy it. To the crew of B-59, trapped in a sweltering, failing submarine with no outside communication, having no way to distinguish a warning tactic from an actual attack, it appeared as though they were under direct assault. Many aboard genuinely believed that war had already broken out on the surface, and that they were meant to respond accordingly. Under the submarine's standing protocol, launching its nuclear-tipped torpedo required the unanimous agreement of 3 senior officers aboard. The submarine's captain, convinced war had begun, was prepared to authorize the launch. The political officer aboard agreed as well. The third officer required to approve the launch was Vasily Arkhipov. He refused. Arkhipov argued under extraordinary pressure and extreme heat, surrounded by crew members who had already begun losing consciousness from oxygen deprivation, that the pattern of depth charges they were experiencing was consistent with a deliberate signal to surface, not a genuine attempt to sink them. He insisted that firing the torpedo based on an assumption rather than confirmed information risked guaranteeing a full nuclear exchange that could not be undone, based on a situation nobody aboard the submarine could actually verify. He held his position. Without unanimous agreement, the torpedo was never launched. The submarine eventually surfaced, and the standoff ended without a single shot fired. He was right. The American depth charges genuinely had been a signaling tactic, not an attack. Because one man, under conditions almost impossible to imagine, refused to agree with the other 2 officers standing beside him, the torpedo that could have triggered a full nuclear exchange between the United States and the Soviet Union was never fired. Many historians who have studied this moment in detail consider it, without exaggeration, the closest the world has ever come to full-scale nuclear war, closer even than the more famous political standoff playing out in Washington and Moscow that same week. 7 more stories. A missing bomb still sitting in a riverbed, a buried weapon under a field in North Carolina, a missile silo destroyed by a dropped tool, A general's unauthorized alert order, a shot-down pilot, and a president who chose to wait, 16 hours of tanks facing each other in Berlin, and one submarine officer's refusal to agree with the two men standing beside him. None of these moments involved a villain pressing a button on purpose. Almost every single one came down to something achingly ordinary. A mechanical failure, a miscommunication, a single person's judgment call, made in a matter of seconds, with consequences that could have permanently altered the course of human history. The closest calls in history rarely look like the movies. They usually look exactly like this. Quiet, mostly forgotten, and far closer than most people will ever realize.